Wonderful to see you.
All right, welcome out to our fantastic panelists this evening. First, we welcome Anita Bernstein, the Anita and Stuart Subotnick Professor of Law at Brooklyn Law School. Professor Cary Nelson will join us as Emeritus Professor of English and Jewish Culture and Society at the University of Illinois. And finally, Professor Amy Wax from here in Philadelphia, the Robert Mundheim Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. So thank you so much for joining us tonight for this profoundly important topic about campus-free speech. This evening in our three different panels, we have three different perspectives. We're starting with the perspective from inside the classroom, the view from the classroom. What does free speech look like from the perspective of the professors who are teaching students at universities across America? And we want to start with this fundamental question. What is academic freedom? What does it mean? And what is it supposed to serve? So I am reminded of an undergrad professor of mine. He was a somewhat cantankerous fellow, and he always used to say, whenever anybody complained about hearing something difficult in class, he had a phrase that stuck with me. He said that the university should be the disturber of the mind's peace. That was the phrase that always stuck out to me, and I've remembered it ever since. So, Anita, you said something similar in an op-ed that you recently wrote for the Philadelphia Inquirer. You said that at campuses across America, professors often say that part of being tough is having to listen to what you don't want to hear. Does academic freedom help, is it designed to help students hear what they don't want to hear? Or what other purposes do you think academic freedom is designed to serve?
That's a hard question because so much of my perspective, as I've recently said, as you mentioned, is informed by the extreme comfort of my job. So what you just mentioned before about your mentor, your undergrad professors saying that what we need is to be disturbed, I think applies to all of us. And I know I dish it out and I try to find ways to take it because I think that requires more outreach and energy, sort of up against a default. I try to set up my classroom so that individuals can disagree with what I've said or say something that I didn't expect or throw a curveball that I don't know how to anticipate. And I hope with that approach to the classroom, I'm transmitting or teaching a message that it's desirable to have your comfort disrupted.
So what about you, Professor Nelson? You had a unique perch for 6 or so years as the president of the Association of University Professors. And this question of academic freedom came before you on a regular basis. What did you take away from that experience? What are the purposes and goals of academic freedom? And if you could take a minute to talk a little bit about what your views are on what academic freedom is.
Sure. Well, it's one of the most useful things you can do if you want to see the history and founding definition of academic freedom is to look at the AAUP's 1915 declaration. That's the year the organization was founded. And except for some kind of in loco parentis biases that had to do with who students were in 1915, it remains really the most eloquent statement I think that the AAUP ever produced. And that it's clear from that document that the first function of academic freedom, the reason for its existence, is really to serve the country and the world. That is to guarantee that faculty members can pursue the truth unfettered by political and religious bias and aggression, but for that purpose of serving the search for the truth. So it has evolved into a way of protecting faculty members, and indeed the AAUP did that in its first year. It also conducted its first investigations, and since then the organization has continued to define principles for academic freedom and also to investigate and censure administrative misconduct. That is, we felt, well, I wasn't around in 1915 as best as I can remember, but the concept was that religious figures, politicians, board of trustees members wouldn't understand academic freedom and would often be subject to impulses that would lead them to compromise it. So the principle was protect faculty members' ability to teach and research, including, and the document is explicit, about willing to disrupt students' beliefs and existing opinions and challenge them. That was built into academic freedom from the first moment. But it had a purpose beyond the protection of individuals, and that was to serve the national purpose of moving research forward, moving knowledge forward, and so forth. What wasn't anticipated in 1915 in any way whatsoever, other than the internet, which the organization said nothing about in 1915, what really wasn't anticipated was the possibility that some individuals, and really more importantly, whole academic disciplines, would abandon the search for the truth, would no longer be committed to that, indeed would be committed to some form of political indoctrination and to advocacy for a set of political beliefs. And that's most intense over the last decade around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where some faculty members in some disciplines have been willing to move away from that fundamental precept and to say academic freedom protects our right to tell what we believe politically, not to search for the truth.
So that's interesting. There's a lot to unpack there, but the core argument seems to be that the purpose, the principal thrust of academic freedom, of protections for faculty to be able to speak, is the pursuit of truth. Professor Wax, you've talked a little bit about the movement on many campuses to create safe spaces for students. Do you see this as antithetical to the purpose of academic freedom, which is to pursue truth? Are these ideas compatible with each other, or are they in tension with each other?
They're not compatible at all, in my opinion. And I think the turn towards trying to create safe spaces on campus to protect students from unpopular or bruising ideas, upsetting ideas, has really been a very baleful turn, and it has grievously compromised the academic mission, academic values, and integrity. And I would emphasize this term academic values. We talk a lot about free speech, but I prefer not to use that because private institutions have no constitutional obligation to give any of their participants freedom of speech. So when I defend academic values, I don't defend it as a matter of law or a matter of constitutional imperative, but rather as a normative imperative that I think academic institutions should respect. Now, what does that require? I don't think that professors should seek to disturb their students, but I think that is a necessary byproduct of the objective, rigorous, fact-based, analytical search for the truth, to examine the merit of claims. And also, there's another mission that I think is central to academic values, which is to transmit the past, what is most valuable, the best that has been thought and said in the past, as Matthew Arnold says, in a way that is even-handed and objective, not slavishly devoted to any particular creed or cult, but rather attempts to assess ideas out of the past, the ideas that are a basis for our way of life, in an even-handed and objective way. And that will necessarily displease some students, upset them, offend them, and all of that. So my view is that when students get to the door of our general academic institutions, for them to immediately request safe spaces, by which I mean psychologically safe, obviously we have the obligation to make them physically safe, for them to demand to be protected from bruising or potentially upsetting ideas, I ask myself, why are you there? Why have you come to these amazingly elaborately expensive institutions, which cost people so much money, when it's really an open question what you think you're going to get out of it. Are we just going to confirm all your prejudices, or are we going to open your mind?
Well, let's talk about some specific examples. Recently, we've seen headlines about a law professor at Harvard, Ron Sullivan, who I think teaches criminal law. And there's a petition circulating from the students criticizing him for being part of the criminal defense team of Harvey Weinstein. And the students have expressed a serious concern, not asking that he not be permitted to represent Mr. Weinstein or that he be removed as a professor, but that his role as a faculty dean for a particular college makes it hard for the students, particularly women at the school, to feel comfortable raising concerns about sexual harassment on campus because of his role representing Mr. Weinstein. In fact, the petition says that his representation of Mr. Weinstein is, quote, not only upsetting, but deeply trauma-inducing. Mm-hmm. Is this a concern that the university ought to be addressing? And what would be the appropriate response to this type of concern?
If students have voiced anxiety and discomfort with the notion that they could bring sexual harassment cases and experiences to him, then I think it's something the university has to deal with. They really have two options. One is to have a hearing, give him a chance to explain himself, see if he can convince students that despite representing Weinstein, he takes sexual harassment seriously and would listen to their cases and listen sympathetically. He could make that kind of position. And if students remained unconvinced by that, then I think the university can relieve him of his administrative responsibility. Or they could decide that the student petition on its own warranted removing him from that role. Academic freedom gives him no protection in his administrative role, none whatsoever. He's an at-will employee in that capacity and could be terminated with no notice whatsoever. Professor Weinstein, we'd like you to pack your belongings within the next 2 hours and leave. A dean, a department head, any kind of an administrator is an at-will employee and can be terminated. So academic freedom really isn't relevant. It's relevant to his right to represent Weinstein. That's protected, and he's protected from consequences as a faculty member, but not in that capacity.
So that's interesting. So we're talking a little bit about what the limits of academic freedom are, and perhaps it doesn't extend to administrative roles and responsibilities. That's your suggestion. Professor Bernstein,
it's at the AUP position, right?
So, Professor Bernstein, does that seem right to you, that academic freedom should be limited to the teaching role, that schools should be able to, say, punish a professor in an administrative way, taking away the chairmanship or taking away some other administrative responsibility or privilege?
I think it was Theodore Roosevelt who said that the President of the United States and any other administrator is a tool to be used up until it's worn out and then discarded. I'm not sure I'd fire him the way, or put fire on the table as overtly as Cary just did. But I think it would be
He would still have his faculty job.
Of course, right, yeah, I'm not touching that at all. Whatever employment rights he has as a professor would remain. I think that the student petition is an exquisite specimen of free speech. I thought it was, what I remember reading of it, I thought it was well written and carefully reasoned. I wouldn't personally have talked about my trauma, but that's just, I guess, a wordsmithing quibble. The expression of views by the students struck me as something pertinent and careful. What to do with Sullivan as an administrator is an administrative question. And I guess you're saying he was punished, and maybe he was in the sense that he suffered a taking or a deprivation of something that he wanted. But he's there to serve the purposes of the institution, and it's his boss's job to decide whether his work as an administrator is consistent with the general operation of the law school.
So this raises an interesting question about the scope of academic freedom. We've talked about limiting it to just the teaching role, and that maybe the university could respond to speech by taking away other privileges. But what about...
But it's not limited just to the teaching role, because those extramural activities, like defending Weinstein, are protected from academic consequences. So academic freedom is one of the capacities, one of the principles that protects him from a sanction for doing that as a public citizen, a university sanction.
He's protected because
in his
he's
role as a faculty member, a teacher, and researcher.
Thank you for that. Is it because he's tenured? What happens to the 76% of teachers who don't have tenure? Professor Wax, should academic freedom extend to those individuals? Does it? Ought it?
Well, first of all, I think untenured people are completely unprotected and therefore very vulnerable to sanctions for expressing politically incorrect views. And my experience going around the country talking to various audiences, academic and non-academic, has convinced me that this is an enormous risk that students, graduate students, and untenured professors are very well aware of. But let me just address this case. Academic freedom, we can argue about the technicalities of it, but my response to what happened to Professor Sullivan is very, very different. If I were the dean of Harvard Law School, I would say to the students, thank you for expressing your opinion and your concerns, but I am going to reject your suggestions because they are a thinly veiled attempt to penalize this person for performing a valuable and essential role as a lawyer to someone who warrants representation, because everybody warrants representation. So that's a teachable moment that the dean could use to instruct the students that this is absolutely essential, that everybody, no matter how nefarious, deserves a defense, number one. Number two, the students' reactions are purely emotional, reactive, subjective. They have no objective basis. It's just, we feel this way, and because we feel this way, you have to indulge our feelings. Now, to give into that is to send exactly the wrong message to the students, right? That they, through their untutored feelings and responses, get to decide who plays what role in the university. I think that is a very, very dangerous practice. I've been the victim of it. My dean, who is supposed to be appearing on the next panel, took away my first-year class because students came into his office and says, we feel like we would be disadvantaged in this class. We feel like Professor Wax is biased. We just feel that way. We have no objective evidence. There is no objective evidence. There's not a shred, an iota, or a dot or tittle of objective evidence that she is in any way biased. But that doesn't matter. It's a fact-free zone. We are going to turn the careers and the fate of our professors into a fact-free zone, and you, the administration, have to give in to our reactions, no matter what the basis for them.
That would have been part of my first suggestion.
Thank you.
The dean could explain that representation of villains is a necessary part of democracy and the legal system, and try to convince the students that that shouldn't affect their attitude. But
they shouldn't try to convince them. He should tell them.
Well,
this is what you learn in law school. We are here to teach you this.
Well, that's perfectly true. But in the end, he has a function to serve if he's to be the person to whom students report their concerns about sexual harassment, and if in the end they just feel uncomfortable in going to him in that role, and they need to go to someone, then the administrator has to deal with that, with their feelings. Even if they're not objective, even if they're irrational, nonetheless, he is imperiled in his ability to serve that function. But I say attempt to defend him, attempt to give those explanations, and then see what the reality is. But they've got to have a person to whom they can have recourse.
Well, you're assuming away professionalism. I think that's one of the problems. To just assume about someone on the faculty that they cannot separate their vital professional role, as you say, representing accused villains, presumed villains, from their role as an advisor to students, I think is really a kind of not the kind of assumption that should be indulged.
You know, we've talked about the Sullivan example. He's engaging in what you've described as a culturally and constitutionally very important role of defending an accused criminal. Let's talk about another context. What about a professor who is tweeting on social media about a topic that is not that professor's area of expertise? Something very controversial. An engineering professor tweeting something very controversial. It's outside the classroom, outside of the university, outside the professor's area of expertise. Professor Bernstein, should academic freedom protect that professor talking about completely unrelated subject matter on a very large megaphone?
I think Amy has enlarged or enlarged the understanding of academic freedom, so I'm not really certain how to answer it. I don't think that this irresponsible or feckless-looking tweeting should have employment consequences for him. Inevitably, and I guess this touches on what Cary and Amy were saying before, just because you don't lose your job doesn't mean you haven't suffered, and I take that seriously. I understand the Sullivan's deprivation would be painful for him. At the same time, lawyers who take on unpopular clients while they're fulfilling an important constitutional role tend to suffer some consequences with respect to other prospective clients. Sullivan is modeling not only the ideal of representing unpopular accused persons, but also the consequences for a defense lawyer in dealing with the controversy that his intake choices, the decisions of whom to represent, will create. He shouldn't necessarily be cosseted from blowback or trouble based on the choices he made. Again, I guess I'm sort of in the middle between Cary and Amy. I don't really know exactly what should happen to him. I think it's a fact kind of laden question, but it seems to be correct that he both enjoys academic freedom. That freedom does even extend in an influential or penumbra-ish way to his work as an administrator, and whether he should remain as an administrator, I think, is for administrators to choose while commending and respecting the expressed views of the students. I do not think, Pache, Amy, that administrators or higher-ups in higher education are somehow not buffeted and blown by their feelings. We all have feelings. It is not the case that the people who run institutions are rational and operating only by facts, whereas undergraduates are driven by emotion and the opposite of reason. So I think we need to be a little less black and white about the authority of who makes the yes or no decisions, as if it were neutral and perfect, and caricaturing the views and opinions of students as being emotional.
Because I've written a lot about that question, let me give you what my answer has been. For many decades, the standard AEUP line was public utterances that are unrelated to your teaching and research, to your professional responsibilities, you're held harmless for them in terms of any university sanctions. That academic freedom protects you not only in your teaching and research roles, but also in public discourse, which can now, of course, be tweets or other forms of social media and so forth, when it's not in your wheelhouse, when it's not in your areas of expertise. So you can be any kind of a fool on social media outside your areas of expertise, and you're protected from university sanctions. And there's plenty of evidence of faculty doing exactly that, behaving ridiculously. However, the AEUP's position for many years was, if you make a statement in social media in any form, in an op-ed, online, whatever, that contradicts the fundamental convictions of your discipline and your areas of research and teaching responsibility, then you can have university consequences. And the example that we like to use, that we use many, many times, actually is an engineering professor who doesn't do this on campus, but publicly he claims that the Holocaust didn't happen, that it's a fake. However, he designs bridges, and it doesn't seem to much affect that. He never talks about this on campus, but he's very valuable in the public domain in making the assertion. He writes about it. I think he's done a couple of quote books claiming that the Holocaust didn't happen. He's protected because it's not his area of responsibility. But the AEUP standard view was that if, say, a professor of European history was to tweet or use a Facebook post that says the Holocaust is a fake, that person's professional competence would be at issue, and what we call professional fitness would be at issue. And because the weight of the discipline is so heavily behind the fact that the Holocaust did indeed happen and that 6 million Jews were murdered, he would be demonstrably incompetent to teach, and in fact, not only could be sanctioned, but could lose his job over that. Now, in 2015, the AEUP decided, over my objections, I must say, strenuous objections, to change its position and say that all comments on social media, op-eds, and other kinds of public discourse are protected by academic freedom, even in the area of the faculty members' teaching and research responsibility. I thought that was a serious error, so now it's a matter of controversy, the degree of protection that you get when you're speaking in public in the areas of your teaching and research. Obviously, social media means that the influence of statements that you make can be vastly larger than anything you publish.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit in terms of the consequences of the two different rules. So if it's the area of the professor's expertise, then it sounds like under the old rule, that's where whatever the professor said would get the least protection, and the most protection would be for areas outside of the professor's expertise. Is that counterintuitive, first? And second, who gets to decide? You described it as the professor could be subject to discipline if the professor is speaking against the fundamental tenets of the discipline, the fundamental kind of accepted truths of the discipline.
Not if there's disagreements in the discipline, but if the weight of the discipline is really absolutely behind a certain truth, then you can be in difficulty in terms of professional fitness.
So this raises an interesting question, which is who's the decider on what these fundamental tenets are, and who kind of polices those boundaries? Professor Wax?
Yeah, well, no, I think that it's very easy to come up with examples like Holocaust denial, where it just seems quite outre or outrageous that someone would take a particular position, the earth is flat, that sort of thing. But, those examples are less common than you think. I think it amazes me regularly how many issues in social science, in history, in the humanities, and even in the so-called hard sciences are still in serious dispute. And I think to say that certain issues are settled canonically, and we as a discipline say that they are slam dunk, open and shut, is potentially very dangerous, because it is so easy for political biases and, let's call it what it is, political correctness, to creep into that. I can think of areas where social scientists would tell me, well, there's just no evidence for this proposition. Certain issues in behavioral psychology or biologics, it's all settled. And I happen to know it's not all settled. So I find that very risky. And we should always err, I think, on the side of giving the widest possible ambit to academic expression and academic freedom, even to the point of licensing really absurd and offensive statements, outrageous statements, because when you're in the marketplace of ideas, you need to be tough. The marketplace of ideas is not for the faint of heart. And we don't teach students that. When students arrive at the university, we need to tell them this is a very potentially bruising operation. You are going to hear some awful things. You are going to hear some things that you believe are completely false, but you're just going to have to put up with them. Now, if you're a Holocaust denier, I think the way to meet that is for other historians to say, the evidence just isn't there, argue it on the merits, give back the evidence that counters these absurd statements. That is the way academic discourse should be conducted. And the attitude towards dissenters, even outrageous dissenters, It's very easy to be censorious and sanctimonious, to label them as evil, to hurl epithets, but I believe that with academic values go obligations. Obligations to remain as dispassionate as you can and counter positions on the merits. It's hard work.
Well, that's the nature of academic debate, and the kind of case I'm talking about is exceedingly rare.
Right.
But, you know, there's another domain that I think, you know, you have to face. If we're talking about the protections that tenured faculty have versus the protections that someone has on the job market and versus untenured faculty members, you know, the things people say affect their peers' judgments of them and affect whether they're going to vote for or against tenure,
right,
or for or against a job appointment. And those things are influential, and beliefs that are held to be seriously defective are going to affect someone's job opportunities.
Right.
And it doesn't matter. And I mean, what you said about contingent faculty, part-time faculty, is absolutely true. They really don't have academic freedom protections. I spent 30 years helping contingent faculty to organize into unions. I traveled all over the country doing it.
Let's get Professor Bernstein's reaction to a lot of these ideas that are...
It's a hard question of what to do with dissenters, and I think it must be the case, Cary, that you're right, that it's extremely rare for a tenured academic to be a Holocaust denier in any field. And I agree with Amy that welcoming a plurality and discomforting production of opinions is very desirable, and dissenters warrant some empathy and even solicitude as we try to decide what to do with them. Eventually, with speech suppression and speech controls, you're always trading off benefits. There are no absolutists that would permit all statements, no matter how injurious, no matter how worthless, to flourish. And I would think, let's say, the other cliche I've heard is the biology professor who says that creationism is true and evolution is false. The academic milieu, I think, could do a lot to blunt or lessen the harm of that position so that students wouldn't be mistaught by it. But I think it could be possible for this statement to be harmful enough to actually hold back knowledge. Mindful of what we were saying before, and I was agreeing, I don't think I said it overtly, that truth is the point of academic freedom. We've got a paradox of truth needing to be challenged and controverted and attacked in order to strengthen itself. But at the end, our goal ought to be to get something that actually helps the world by being true, by being factually accurate. That's why maybe I sound mealy-mouthed, but I think that the dissenting professor needs both sanction and support.
Well, can I just, we're talking in very abstract terms here, but there are certainly in academia today areas where dissent should be heard loud and clear, but there is a dominant orthodoxy that stifles dissent. Let's take the very hot button issue of gender differences. James Damore, who wrote a memo at Google that got him fired, saying that effectively opining that the reason that women were underrepresented in STEM is that they were less interested and less capable and less able to withstand the highly competitive atmosphere there. Would he survive as a junior professor in elite academia today? That's a serious question. I submit that he would not. And that is wrong because there was evidence that supported his position. It doesn't mean that at the end of the day he would prevail on this issue, but certainly it was arguable. So there are a number of arenas, I submit, in academia where people who take unpopular positions are putting their future and their career at serious risk as a practical matter. And it is very hard to construct checks on that kind of result.
Well, let's talk about that. How do you construct checks? You've got the next panel is university administrators, right? The decision makers in many important respects. What would be the advice that you would give the next panel and other university administrators about how to shore up the academic freedoms that you are worried are being threatened? What would be your advice for those university administrators?
Don't give in to pressure from so-called protected grievance identity groups, which happens every single day of the week in the universities, do not grovel to feminists about someone like James Damore. Say James Damore, has a creditable point of view. Now, you could say that to students. That's easy because we're in the role of trying to instruct students and guide them. It's much harder to say that to faculty members, the people who control the Women's Studies department or the sociology department or whatever. I think the ultimate check here is integrity, individual integrity of the faculty members and the administrators themselves. And there is no substitute for that. And I think that is what is seriously in danger in academia right now. Honesty, intellectual honesty, to admit that the whole issue of gender differences is not a one-sided issue.
Now, Professor Nelson, Professor Wax has suggested that individual integrity is one possible solution to address her concerns about academic freedom. You've devoted a lot of your career to thinking about structural protections and thinking institutionally about academic freedom. What would be your question to the university administrators or your recommendation?
In the Damore case, if he's an assistant professor coming up for tenure, his colleagues are going to have to decide whether his research represents a valuable contribution to the field. They're going to make a judgment about that, and I think you're right that the judgment in the current world is likely to be negative. I'm not sure I'd be willing to see a university president overturn it. But I think what university presidents, especially presidents as up the highest level administrators, need to be willing to be eloquent defenders of the principles of academic freedom. And when they feel that their faculty is violating those principles, as the faculty at Pitzer College recently did in wanting to overturn a study abroad program at Haifa University, Marvin Oliver, the president, was extremely eloquent in saying that that was a form of academic boycott. He rejected it utterly, and he refused to honor the faculty vote, majority vote, to eliminate the study abroad program. He'll probably get more than a lot of flack from his faculty, maybe a vote of no confidence, but he did the right thing as a president. He stood up for the principle of academic freedom and that study abroad program shouldn't be eliminated. What I want from administrators more now than in the recent past is eloquence in defense of the fundamental principles of the university. And it takes some backbone to do that. In Oliver's case, the faculty may demand that he be ousted for standing up for the university's fundamental values, but that's what I want from
So
such
Professor
people.
Bernstein, backbone. That's Professor, we've got integrity, backbone, and in your wonderful op-ed for the Philadelphia Inquirer, if I can summarize it, it sounded to me like your advice is physician heal thyself to university professors, that perhaps university professors are cocooned from any sort of criticism in interesting ways and perhaps need to be more open-minded themselves to hearing criticism. What would be what's your number one takeaway for the administrators who are going to be up next for what you think your greatest concern is about academic freedom, if you're concerned about the state of academic freedom, and what would be either the question you would want to ask them or the recommendation for these administrators?
I do think physician heal thyself is a pretty good summary, but because your question is about not what we professors can do, but what the administrators and university presidents in the front row can do, I would ask them to keep in mind the voices that we're not hearing, the speech that isn't getting spoken. James Damore has a lot of followers, and he's not in the academy. Anyway, has plenty of support. There are many individuals in the university community, and I'm thinking about students in particular, but also the contingent faculty for whom Cary has advocated so long and well, and invite the administrators who have control over budgets and and planning to think about how to foster speech for everybody, not just the tiny lucky minority who have academic freedom to back up whatever they want to say, and also enjoy a degree of job security that's very enviable. So for instance, I would say that small classes, other things being equal, beat large classes, because in a small class a student will typically feel a little more comfortable speaking. I've heard fascinating comments from students now that my torts class has shrunk. I teach in this 2-year JD program that my school has, and they start in the summer, and that's a minority taste. So we get a little group. It's necessarily kind of seminar-like, and I hear much more deeply the engagement of the students than I did in a large tiered lecture. And I hope that, and I know it's easy for me to say, that you can find the money and the generosity to improve the working conditions of contingent faculty and other untenured instructors so that they can share in the glory that's academic freedom, if you can. But I'm dipping my hand in your wallet and writing a check. I don't think I should do that.
Well, so this is terrific. So we have integrity, a backbone, and more money. Those are our 3 solutions for academic freedom on campus. Can we give a big round of applause to our wonderful guests?